Good afternoon, everyone, and good evening and good morning. Just to let you know, we will be starting in approximately 2 minutes. So thanks for your patience. And as soon as, yeah, I'll be back in about 2 minutes. So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Laude and Valideus update from ICANN 63 Barcelona. It is Tuesday, the 6th of November. And just to let you know, the webinar is going to be about 30 minutes in length and is being recorded as well. So my name is Dietmar, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar. On the call with me today, I have Sophie Hay, who is the Assistant Client Manager, Jeff Newman, who's SVP for Laude, myself, a Senior Manager, and Ashley Roberts, who is also a Senior Manager. I'm going to just put the agenda up on the screen. So as you can see from the agenda, the topics we're going to talk about are what are the priorities for ICANN? Sophie is going to handle that one for us today. The latest developments on the subsequent procedures PDP working group, and Jeff will be kind enough to hold our hand through that. There's innovations in new GTLD's session, and that'll be myself. And GDPR, how it is impacting the industry, and next steps, that'll be handled by Ashley. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. If you have any questions, please feel free to send them to experts@valideus.com, or you can use the chat box as well. We have already received some questions, and we'll look to answer those questions as well as the ones that are emailed to experts@valideus.com. If we're unable to get to those questions, we will send replies through to the people that asked those questions. Also, if you have any issues, whilst going through the webinar, i.e. being kicked off or any of those types of things, you can also email experts@valideus.com. But last but not least, a tiny small disclaimer. We are not a law firm, and as such, we are not providing any legal advice during this call. We can answer queries without giving specific legal advice. So just a little disclaimer there. So without any further ado, I'd like to give Sophie Hay the floor, and she'll be talking about what are the priorities for ICANN. Sophie. Sorry, we had some technical glitches there. Sophie's now available.
Okay, so today I'll be talking about different ICANN priorities. So the main point where these priorities come from is ICANN's strategic plan for the financial years 2021 through to 25. Now, from this report, we can see that they and the plan they're working on so far is on security. So particularly they're focusing on Internet of Things and the ongoing stability of the DNS, governance of ICANN, particularly accountability, transparency, and also recent issues which have been discussed in the NSO Council on volunteer and staff fatigue in policy efforts. There's also unique identifier system that's up for consideration over the next 5 years, particularly IDNs and adapting to new technologies. And then the two which have the largest focus, listening to Shireen at the opening ceremony, are geopolitics, particularly increased government involvement in ICANN and regulating the internet in general, and also finance, particularly with a focus on increased fiscal prudence. So I'll start by talking through the geopolitics aspect of it. So as you may be aware, there's been increasing pressure from governments for influence in managing the DNS, but there's also these competing concerns of wanting to avoid the government control and for ICANN to remain in the private sector. Also from globally, we're also looking at the risk of fragmentation of the internet. So a couple of comments to highlight from board member leaving speeches, So Luce van der Laan also encouraged the community to focus on ICANN's technical remit and mission to move away from the political aspects and minimum influence. We also had Mike Silber hinting that ICANN was potentially replaceable, and for ICANN to actually show that they added value to the management of the domain name system. And finally, we had George Sadowski highlighting the global nature of the internet and the need for there to be trust in what ICANN does. So this comes back to the issue of the fragmentation of the internet and the risk of governments or a couple of governments going ahead and creating their own internet. So this could give rise to issues such as predictability and rights protection. Issues such as which internet should brand owners be using, and limited audiences for who can access which internet and who can't, and if there's going to be any, if any, links between the different internets. So it also gives rise to how to enforce rights across different internets, because it would ultimately mean different rules on how to protect and what can be protected on the internet, and also different policy processes that could be engaged in and how that would work, whether it would be a similar ICANN model or not. That's the context for the geopolitics and why it's a priority for ICANN. On finance, the big announcement they've been trying to push with the strategic plan is that they want it to be underpinned by a financial plan. Also, as Jeff will go on to discuss, the next round of TLD applications is being considered in subsequent procedures. And from a financial perspective, ICANN will want to make that a priority for a stream of revenue as part of this move towards fiscal prudence. It was also highlighted throughout ICANN 63 that Euron's busy moving ICANN org towards a 2-year budget cycle, which theoretically means there should be some greater certainty in understanding what happens year to year at ICANN. All this does lead to ultimately the replenishment of the reserve fund by auction funds from the previous round, where contention sets were resolved and by a last resort through ICANN, and the proceeds of the winning bid would go into this auction fund. So those funds have been sitting there since, and there's been a cross-community working group trying to decide what to actually do with those funds and how they can be accessed. This should have an impact on the existing subsequent procedures discussions for the next round. And on top of that, the initial report is open for public comment on that cross-community working group for auction funds. And the supplementary initial report is also discussing how to manage contention sets, specifically with auctions. So with ICANN board having taken the initiative and said, well, we're going to move some of the funds from the auction fund into the reserve fund, there could be some public comments taking some influence on how that's going to work in the next round of TLD applications. There's potential that there won't be much support for contention sets to be resolved through ICANN, or ICANN to have control of the funds because of this movement. But as at the moment, there are no comments on either report, so it's unclear which way that will go. And I'll pass now over to Jeff.
Jeff, you're up now.
Yep, thank you, Dietmar, and welcome everyone. So, really quick disclaimer, I am one of the co-chairs for the subsequent procedures working group, which is the working group looking at the policy behind the last round, 2012, and looking forward to the next round or rounds, and trying to apply any lessons learned. If we could, I think we are on, if we can go back one slide to start with work tracks 1 through 4, thank you, Dietmar. So the subsequent procedures work was divided basically into two different groups, where what we called work tracks 1 through 4 took on probably 80 or 90% of all of the subjects that the working group had to look at as part of the 2012 round. And so the next 3 slides, we'll talk about work tracks 1 through 4. Then we'll take a minute to talk about work track 5, which deals with geographic names at the top level. And then a prediction or more like a rough guess as to what the process might be once the policy work is completed. So as you can see, in October 30th, so just about a week ago or so, the Subsequent Procedures Working Group released what we call the Supplemental Initial Report. These cover 5 issues that I'll talk about in a slide coming up, but basically cover some materials that weren't adequately covered in the first initial report that came out in July. So an initial report came out in July that covered numerous topics, and comments were received, and the comment period ended at the end of September. So on this timeline, you'll see that we released the initial report in October. November, so that's this month here, we're starting to review those initial report comments that we got in, and there were more than 70 comments that were submitted, hundreds of pages of materials, very comprehensive. So it'll take a little bit of time to go through all of that. In December, so next month, we will end the comment period for the supplemental initial report, review those comments in January along with the continuing the initial report comments, with a goal of hopefully finalizing proposals in March 2019 and delivering a final report to the GNSO Council in the second quarter of 2019. Supplemental report we'll talk about in a minute, but it can be found at that link that's at the bottom of this slide. If we can go on to the next slide. So work track 5 deals with geographic names at the top level. This group is run a little bit differently than the other work tracks in that it's got a co-lead from the generic name supporting organization, the country code name supporting organization, the at-large advisory group, and the governmental advisory committee. So it's got one representative as a co-lead from each of those groups because of the sensitive nature of geographic names at the top level. The goal is that they publish a report towards the end of this month, an initial report out for comment with their preliminary recommendations on a number of topics, but you'll find when you read that report later this month, in a number of areas where consensus has not yet been achieved or where it looks like will be difficult to achieve, there will be a summary of different positions regarding everything like city names or other types of geographic names at the top level, mountains, rivers, lakes, and things like that. Comments will be due somewhere around mid-January 2019. We'll complete the analysis, draft a final report. Again, will hopefully come out in quarter 2 of 2019 to be synced up with the work tracks 1 through 4, so that when the GNSO Council gets a final report, it will get a final report of all of the different groups at once. If We can go on to the next slide. So what does this look like going forward? Well, again, this is just kind of reading the tea leaves and estimating the work that needs to be done, and really kind of a best case scenario if everything proceeds as it is supposed to. So we talked about submitting the final report to council towards the end of the second quarter 2019. Assuming everything goes okay and the GNSO Council adopts the recommendations, that could be as early as Q3 2019. It would pass that to the board. The board would then have to do a public comment period and hopefully could approve those policy recommendations towards the end of 2019. If it took a year to implement, to do that implementation work with the community, the board could adopt an applicant guidebook towards the end of 2020. And then one of the recommendations so far, and again, we haven't analyzed all the comments that have come in, but so far one of the recommendations from the first initial report was to do something called a registry service provider pre-approval process, meaning that back-end technical providers that provide those registry services to numerous top-level domains could actually undergo an initial review earlier than looking at the applications themselves. This would provide brands or anyone else that wanted to apply for top-level domains an option of choosing a pre-approved backend provider, whether that's someone like Newstar, Affilius, VeriSign, Nominet. There's plenty of them out there now. They could choose that one and not have to go through the technical evaluation when they apply. Hopefully, we're looking at Q2 2021 starting that application submission period. So that would be roughly after a 6-month what's called an outreach period for ICANN to get the word out that they'll be starting a new round. Again, these are just guesses, don't hold us to it, but this is what the community is striving towards. If we go to the next slide, at this point, there is a supplemental initial report that is out for public comment. That comment that comment period will end on December 12th, 2018. Valideus, we will certainly respond to that supplemental initial report, like many of the constituencies and stakeholder groups within the ICANN community. The 5 topics that this initial report covers, or supplemental initial report covers, are what's known as mechanisms of last resort, which we all think of at this point as ICANN auctions, because if a contention set, if there were more than one applicant that applied for a string and all of those got through the full evaluation and objections and everything else, in the 2012 round, there was an ICANN auction, which obviously favored those with the most amount of money. And there's still debate going on as to how ICANN is going to use those funds generated from the 2012 round. Some in the community feel like this mechanism, it may not be the most fair mechanism, especially to those that are running nonprofits or those in the developing world where they do not necessarily have the resources, the financial resources that others do, and therefore are at a disadvantage in winning any kind of contention set. So other mechanisms are proposed, such as potentially a comparative evaluation of which application serves the public interest the best, or even randomizing the list of applicants for a particular string and choosing the winner through some kind of draw process. The second topic deals with private resolution of contention sets. So that is in the 2012 round, ICANN said that our applicants should be encouraged to resolve their contention sets privately before submitting themselves to an ICANN auction. Many, if not most, of the contention sets that were resolved during this phase were resolved with private auctions where the winning party in an auction paid out the losing parties. So the losing parties divided the proceeds that the winning party paid. And so that was seen by many in the community as providing a financial benefit for actually losing a contention set. And some have argued, including the ICANN board, in one of its comments submitted to the initial report, that this would not be the best option from a reputational standpoint, and there was a fear that some would apply for new GTLDs solely for the purpose of losing an application but gaining some kind of financial benefit. So there's a discussion on potential options to consider other than the private auctions that were done. The last three topics, won't go into much detail on these. They're all in the supplemental initial report, but there's a discussion of what kind of changes could be made to applications during the review process. What is the actual role of public comments that come in on an application? Can they actually impact the evaluation results? And if they do, what rights does an applicant have to respond to those? And finally, a discussion, more a brainstorming session on what registries could do if they did not receive adequate support from registrars in distributing their top-level domains. So some niche players, some smaller registries were not necessarily able to attract much attention to distribute their TLDs in the 2012 round. And so this question asks whether there's anything that can be done to help those registries out. I know that's a lot of material. We will be working on submitting comments, and if you have any comments, please do get in touch with us by sending us an email or giving us a call to hear your concerns or comments on the next round of new GTLDs. And with that, I will turn it over to Dietmar.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Hi, everyone. So the section I'm going to talk about is innovation within the new GTLD environment. And the first one I'm going to look at is .art. And during the ICANN 63 meeting, .art was on the panel, and they spoke about how they're utilizing Whois resource records for the art community as a whole. And one of the things they were looking at doing is, you'll see at the bottom of the page there's a little image, and that's taken from a Whois record. And as you can see, what they've done is they've been able to add in the type of record, who the artist is, when the painting was actually painted, where the actual painting is housed. So in this case, Gladstone Gallery, New York and Brussels. So this is actually a really interesting use of the resource records. And although .art is a limited distributed TLD, there is some value in using the resource records for .brand TLDs. So for example, if you were a TV channel, for example, you could show when a TV series was made, who the director was, producers, how many episodes, what was the series link. If you had dealing with authors, you could put in the name of an author, for example, who the publisher of that particular book might be, what the ISBN identifier number is. And even if it's a bank, you could put in, branch numbers and address for that particular branch. And using as an example in the UK, you use a sort code, and the sort code determines where your branch is. So you could put that type of information into the Whois resource records. Although this is a good idea, there is some work that would need to be done if a brand or any registry for that matter was to look at putting a resource records or utilizing the additional resource records in their Whois record. They'd need to go through a registry evaluation process called an RCEP. And if anybody's interested in that, they can feel free to give us a call or a shout and drop us an email, and we can explain that process through to everyone. So that was a really good use of the Whois records. The next one is .bot, and .bot is a open TLD, so distributed TLD, but they do have validations. So Amazon Registry Services spoke a little bit about the .bot TLD and how this is quite a good way for the bot community to be to make themselves more known within the rest of the community. So you would have, for example, a chat bot, let's call it chatbot Dietmar, and you want to send people to that particular chatbot, you would apply for Dietmar.bot, for example, and then you would provide the actual relevant code behind that particular bot to the Amazon Registry Services portal, and then that would then be validated to ensure that, firstly, you are who you say you are, that the information that you provided is accurate, and that the actual bot does function. So this is quite a nice way to keep a nice, clean and valid TLD space. So using a little bit of validations and ensuring that the people that are applying for the for the second level name are who they say they are. And just to be clear, this is a pre-validation, so a pre-registration validation. So the person that is applying for the bot is expressing an interest in having the bot, gets validated, and if they are successful, then they go through the process of going to a registrar through the normal channels, go to the registrar and apply for that particular name. Couple of quick ones. .fox. .fox, as everyone knows, Fox has a studio lot in LA, and it is massive. And Fox decided, you know what? People get lost in that lot quite regularly. It's quite old, so people walk around and they get lost. So they created a web app called Wayfinder.fox. When you go to that web app, it then geolocates where you are via your GPS in your phone, and you're able to then navigate your way through the lot, which is quite a nice way to ensure that your guests as well as your stars aren't late for getting to recording of their shows, for example. I'm sure they get little carts that drive them to the right place, but they could get lost. Another example was CERN. That's the European Organization for Nuclear Research. They have also just recently publicized their new website, which is home.cern. But one of the things that came out of the conversation from .cern was that the technical teams within their organization were very receptive to the idea of the .cern name, and they had some really cool ideas. Obviously, the environment we were in, those ideas can't be made public, but the technical team has had some really good ideas. The next topic is a technical one, so I'm going to not spend too much time on it, but HSTS, which is a protocol for browsers, which then determines that if you, so let me start that again. HSTS is something that Google is pushing at the moment, along with other providers, and it's something that you can put either your top level name, so let's say .dietmar, into the Chrome list. And what that means is that if somebody goes to #1fan.dietmar, it will then automatically push you towards the HTTPS version of that particular website. So what this is trying to do is trying to get everyone in the community involved in making sure that the websites that people are going to, customers, etc., is secure. So you can either do it via the top level name, so .dietmar, or you can actually do it via the #1fan.dietmar specifically, so TLD specific. This is not just for Chrome. This is a standard that is used on both IE, Safari, Firefox, etc. If there's anybody on the call that would like to ask any further questions about this, feel free to drop us a line, and we will endeavor to explain it in an easy manner. So that was just me. Thank you very much for listening on the innovations. I'm now going to pass the call over to Ashley. So bear with me 1 second. There we go.
Okay, thank you, Dietmar. So I'm going to talk a bit about the status of the work that's been going on to address WHOIS and GDPR. Talking a bit about the EPDP. So as many of you will be aware, since the GDPR came into effect in May of this year, large parts of WHOIS records for GTLD domains have been redacted. Now, registries and registrars have been permitted by ICANN to do this redaction of the registration data through what's called the temporary specification. And this is an addendum to the contracts that registries and registrars have with ICANN. Now, as the name of that specification implies, it's a temporary measure which was put in place to act as a stopgap and allow some additional time for the community to develop a permanent solution to actually address this, this issue of WHOIS compliance with the GDPR. And so it's actually the task of this expedited policy development process working group, what we know as the EPDP. It's the job of that working group to develop this permanent policy for how WHOIS will be compliant with the GDPR. So the actual job of the EPDP is to make a determination about whether the temp spec that's in place in the moment should be just simply made permanent. So in other words, what we have in the WHOIS system right now would be made permanent, or whether that temp spec should be changed in any way with respect to registration data that's collected and published. The EPDP working group is working to a deadline of the 25th of May next year, and you might notice that that's exactly 1 year since GDPR came into effect. What that also links up with is 1 year since the temporary place, and that deadline is there because the temporary specification is not able to exist beyond a 1 year time frame. So that 25th of May 2019 deadline is a hard deadline to have something in place. The EPDP working group have divided the work they're doing up into 2 phases. The first phase, and the one which they're working on at the moment, is addressing a number of gating questions mostly around what registration data and what should be redacted. Now, as I say, that work is still ongoing at the moment, and the kind of preliminary thinking of the working group, potentially some preliminary recommendations, are going to be put into an initial report. That initial report was meant to be published just prior to ICANN 63. There have been a few delays with that, so it's now scheduled to be published in a couple of weeks on the 19th of November. Upon publication, that initial report will be open for public comment, so that will be an opportunity for any of you to feed in your own views on thinking to come out of that working group and any preliminary recommendations they may have. So that's phase 1 of the EPDP work. Phase 2, which will commence after phase 1, is around the question of access. And yet we can see on the slide here that it has a kind of more detailed timeline for this work. Points 7, 8, and 9 on this timeline, they're more kind of procedural, administrative parts of the process, whereby recommendations that come out of the working group need to be approved by different authorities and different levels within ICANN. So this timeline actually builds in an allowance for that those administrative processes, which is why, even though the working group has a final deadline of May next year, they're publishing or aiming to publish their initial report this month. So yeah, as I said, that's the second phase of the work is looking at the question of access to or disclosure of the redacted registration data for third parties with legitimate interests. So if we move on to the next slide, that takes me on nicely to talk about a unified access model. So while the EPD on their gating questions, their phase 1, in the last few months, ICANN initiated a separate process whereby they've been soliciting input from the community on what a unified access model for redacted registration data might look like. And ICANN's stated aim of this process is that whatever input they get from the community, they can then feed into the EPDP working group once that working group comes to address their phase 2, when they actually discuss access. So that unified access model discussion has been going on for some months now. Just prior to the recent ICANN meeting, ICANN published a blog in which they provided an update to the community about how that's all going. And importantly, in that blog, they outlined that they've been considering the kind of feasibility of a centralized WHOIS system, which could be coordinated by ICANN. Now, the idea behind such a model would be that, as well as coordinating the WHOIS system, ICANN would assume responsibility, and importantly, they'd assume liability from registries and registrars for disclosing redacted registration data to any third parties with a legitimate interest. Now, this has the potential to be kind of potentially acceptable to different groups across the ICANN spectrum. There's been sounds from the business and IP community that they would favour such a model. And during the ICANN, registries and registrars sent a joint letter to ICANN in which they outlined kind of tentative approval for the concept of a centralized model, and one where ICANN would assume the responsibility from the registries and registrars for disclosing redacted data. Now, I mean, I should say that that was just tentative approval from the contracted parties. They did caveat their letter by saying that the concept would need to be explored a lot more, and then need to be more meat put on the bones. And so it's still a very, very early stage in this idea of a centralized WHOIS model, but it could potentially be a way through this issue. So it's something that we're going to keep our eyes on. But as well as determining the kind of practicality and feasibility of it, one huge hurdle that's going to need to be explored and overcome is to discuss the concept with the European Data Protection Board and actually try and get some guidance. Such a centralized model would actually be legal and compliant with GDPR. But we're certainly going to be keeping our eyes on this development, and we'll be informing everybody when there are significant movements. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Dietmar.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you very much to everyone for joining the call today. And whoops, sorry, there we go. Everyone's got to see the final slide. If you have any questions or any comments or whatever, as I mentioned before, please fire off an email to experts@valideus.com. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. We will be sending around a link to the recording in the next few days, so keep an eye out for that. And you will be able to obviously then re-listen to what everything is that we said. And yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and I hope you all have an awesome day. Thank you. Bye-bye.